Hi, I'm still here with Manon Hedenborg-White from the University of Uppsala talking about Wicca. And one of the things you mentioned in our other video was that a big issue within Wicca, or an issue that often arises, is gender, or gender questions related to Wicca. Why is that, and what are the kind of questions it brings up?
Well, I think one thing is you could kind of say about the Western esoteric tradition in general, since at least the mid-1800s, that it has been very preoccupied with gender issues, and that is definitely the case with Wicca. One thing is that sort of when Wicca emerged in the 1950s, it was quite radical in its attitude towards sort of female leaders, and it produced a lot of strong sort of female leader figures in the whole kind of Wiccan community at that time. At the same time, Gardner definitely was not what we'd call a feminist today.
Right.
He had quite sort of conservative ideas about what women should be like, and wrote some pretty kind of misogynist things actually in some of his writings. And he was also very anti-homosexuality and very sort of conservative in that way. But I think that whole sort of, still the way that he kind of allowed women to take on very strong sort of positions of authority kind of enabled a lot of people to come into Wicca that would later sort of challenge his ideas. And definitely that's what happened when it spread to the United States and kind of merged with the feminist movement there. But it also happened in Britain. So in the last sort of 50 years, there's been a really sort of intense and interesting kind of ongoing debate about gender issues in Wicca, and partly about the roles of men and women, but also kind of about masculinity and femininity and what those concepts mean, because Wicca is very sort of, traditionally Wicca is very based around the concept of gender polarity, where we have the divine in the shape of a god and a goddess, and the god represents a number of things and the goddess represents a different number of things, and that is sort of seen as a kind of universal balance that operates everywhere. And in recent years there's been kind of a debate about how that might reinforce kind of stereotypical conceptions of men's and women's roles, and there's been an increasing kind of critique of that, and also of kind of it from the point of view of heteronormativity and what LGBTQ Wiccans can sort of do to create a kind of religious practice that reflects their experiences and that doesn't necessarily celebrate the divine in the shape of like a heterosexual kind of polarity. So there's been a really kind of interesting debate about that.
There's quite at the heart of Wicca, in the way that I've always seen, there's quite an interesting tension. On one hand, it's always been very welcoming to people from a variety of different kind of sexualities, and people who've got very different ideas about where sexual roles are and gender roles and things. So on one hand, it's very kind of open to that and very liberal and allows for a lot of people to kind of renegotiate their identity. But on the other hand, it's got this sense of the natural. And natural law, in a sense, can be very conservative.
Absolutely.
It can look to the natural world, and if you think of natural moral law and Catholicism as an ethical system, that's incredibly conservative in many ways. So there's a tension between that kind of what is natural and this idea of the kind of natural balance, the male and the female existing, and the kind of things you talk about in Gardner's work, about how these are fixed by nature and you can't kind of do much about that. And the kind of, I suppose, original conception of fertility as being so much at the heart of it. So there's kind of a tension that I guess is something that Wiccans continue to have to negotiate.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that. And also I think it becomes kind of an issue when a lot of younger people come into Wicca who weren't there when it all started, and who might have not necessarily come into Wicca through Gardner's work, but might have read like Starhawk's writings and that kind of thing, and who might come into it with more sort of with a more kind of postmodern take on gender and what that is. And I definitely think when I've talked to young Wiccans, like in my research, it seems to be kind of an issue of like where people kind of have very sort of ambivalent views. They can go, well, on the one hand, I do believe in the god and goddess, and I do think that kind of fertility and sex and that kind of thing is really fundamental to nature and the way it all works. On the other hand, I don't see people in that way, and I don't necessarily see gender sort of in the human sphere as operating in the same way. So it's definitely something that people have to sort of negotiate.
So I guess those young Wiccans that you're talking about come into it, and for them, the issues around gender identity and about kind of sexuality, they bring that with them as a kind of given, that that's fluid, or that's plural, or that's open to negotiation. And so they wouldn't even kind of, that's not something up for negotiation for them. That's kind of, any religious system they adopt, it's going to have to be willing to accommodate the views they bring to that.
Yeah, definitely seems like it.
And Wicca, I guess, has less problems perhaps than some of the more conventional religions in adopting that.
Absolutely.
There's still a source of some tension.
Yeah, it definitely is. It really is. Yeah, I think it was a very there was a very big thing a few years ago at Pantheacon, I think it's called. It's this big sort of goddess conference in the States, when I think it was Z Budapest, who was one of the people who was really sort of instrumental to that whole incorporation of radical feminist ideas into Wicca, organised a sort of goddess-oriented workshop, and didn't want to allow transgender women who were pre-op, I think, to come into that. And that sparked a huge debate because, of course, a lot of people really outraged about that. Yeah. Whereas other people said that, well, maybe if you are born a biological woman, you have experiences that you can't really share as a transgender woman. Whereas, again, other people found that really offensive and said, well, shouldn't we be able to celebrate people's choices and right to sort of do their will and what's right to them, and who are we to say that this person is a man or a woman, or sort of. So that really highlighted a lot of tension, and definitely I think between sort of the older and the younger generations as well.
That probably parallels a discussion already within feminism that at the moment we're seeing a big kind of a source of, again, use that word, tension between radical feminists of a certain kind and transgender feminists who feel they're not fully included in a kind of feminism that has some of its roots in a kind of biological sense of what being a woman is. Yeah. And therefore whether shared growing up as a woman experiences count or not. Yeah. I guess that's, in the community with as many people from a variety of sexuality in this Wicca, that's going to be a kind of a focus of it.
Right. No, definitely parallels that. And I think it's also really interesting the way in which, because a lot of Wiccans are quite well educated and usually sort of in the humanities and arts and that kind of thing. So a lot of people are really aware of sort of what's been happening in gender studies in the last few decades. So a lot of Wiccans are quite quick to sort of adopt those theories, which we can also see happening in Thelema and in the OTO and organisations like that. It's
a religion made of academics that never stop kind of arguing and debating. Exactly. Which to me is an advantage and disadvantage. But, it makes for it being quite interesting.
It is very interesting, definitely.
Thank you.